On January 22, 1783, Congress ratified a contract stating that all bills of credit emitted, monies borrowed, and debts contracted by or under the authority of Congress before the assembling of the United States in pursuance of the present Confederation shall be deemed and considered a charge against the United States for payment and satisfaction whereof the United States and the public faith are hereby solemnly pledged. The party that the U.S. owed these loans to? King George. I hope this paints a picture for you of how Great Britain funded both sides of the Revolution. To this day, Great Britain collects taxes from the United States via the IRS. The IRS isn't even an agency of the United States government. If you don't believe me, look up IRS publication 6209. The FCC, CIA, FBI, and NASA were never part of the United States government. The U.S. government only holds shares of the stock in various agencies. Social Security numbers are also issued by the UN through the IMF. The Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, was also instigated by Amschel Rothschild to divide the United States and force it into debt with a central bank. The goal was to put the country of the U.S. back into the hands of Britain through huge loans taken out for munitions. To do this, it was crucial to put a controversial issue in limbo such as slavery. Knowing full well that the Declaration of Independence would create an uproar among southern states that depended heavily upon slave labor, it was signed in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania by 35 people. John Brown was a Rosicrucian who was brought to power by William Lloyd Garrison and Senator Charles Sumner, both descendants of the line. With the help of the New York Times, John Brown was built up to be a hero in the anti-slavery movement. Ulysses S. Grant, former president, was born Hiram S. Grant. This name was given to him by his father, Master Jesse Root Grant. Jesse Root Grant worked for John Brown's father and then went on to work for E.A. Collins, one of the 13 bloodlines. Ulysses S. Grant was brought to power rapidly with help from Collins. From April 1861 to May 1864, Grant went from the rank of private to commander-in-chief of the entire Union Army. Once Grant was appointed president, his cabinet consisted of 8 freemen, including Alphonso Taft, which was William Taft's father, who was also an ancestor of Bill Clinton. Jonas Mills Bundy was one of the 13 bloodlines, who was also the presidential advisor to Grant as well as the next 2 presidents. And cabinet member Columbus Delano was Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather. In November 21, 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt wrote, "The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the large centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson." Abraham Lincoln's father was A.A. Springs, who was part of the Rothschild dynasty. Lincoln's half-brother worked for Louis Cass Payzer in the Merovingian dynasty, which was the 13th bloodline. Payzer also owned Jekyll Island, which was where the Federal Reserve Bank was created. In the mid-1800s, Abraham Lincoln and the Whigs were trying desperately to keep Andrew Jackson from establishing a gold standard called the Independent Treasury System. Lincoln and his party fought to set up a central bank, making such public speeches as, "Under a gold and silver standard, all will suffer more or less, and very many will lose everything that renders life desirable." This statement resounds elements of scare tactics in this speech and other speeches on the matter given by Abraham Lincoln. They give no real evidence or explanation. In the early 1900s, after a failed attempt for Woodrow Wilson to set up what was called the League of Nations following World War I, Wilson and his advisor, Colonel House, set up the Institute of International Affairs. This institute had 2 branches. One set up in England called the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and the Council on Foreign Relations was incorporated as the American branch in New York on July 29, 1921. Founding members include Colonel House, J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and a few others. A national income tax was declared unconstitutional in 1895 by the Supreme Court, but a constitutional amendment was proposed in Congress by Senator Nelson Aldrich. This makes much more sense when you notice that Nelson Aldrich was also known as being the authentic voice of J.P. Morgan and later married into the Rockefeller family. Today, 27 to 35% of American workers' pay is taxed, and this money goes to a central bank called the Federal Reserve, or the Fed. For those of you who are unaware of the Federal Reserve Bank and what it is capable of, it is a non-government-owned bank that provides the U.S. with all of its currency. They control the inflation rate by the amount of money in circulation. Yet the most amazing aspect of the central bank is the suspension of specie payments, in which the Fed can refuse to pay their obligations, yet taxpayers must pay their debts or go bankrupt. In other words, the suspension of specie payments is the central bank's right to breach a contract with no penalty whatsoever. In even simpler terms, it's called theft. How is it that the Fed is allowed to breach any contract they wish without penalty from the government? The answer is simple. The Federal Reserve Bank has power over the government instead of under it. Carroll Quigley, Bill Clinton's mentor while at Georgetown University, wrote of central banks, "They want nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole, controlled in a feudalist fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent private meetings and conferences." It is important to note that nearly all of the founders of the Federal Reserve Bank were involved in the conception of the Council on Foreign Relations. Since 1934, when the Fed was established, almost every United States Secretary of State, all Secretaries of War or Defense since Henry L. Stimson, almost every head of CIA since Allen Dulles, nearly all presidential candidates, Dwight D. Eisenhower, JFK, Richard Nixon, and Bill Clinton were members of the CFR. George Bush Sr. was actually the CFR director from 1977 to 1979. Understand that all of these high-ranking government positions were lobbied into place by the organizations set up by the international banking cartel. There are secret meetings held everywhere by many of the same members in the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderberg Group, the Club of Rome, the United Nations, and the two branches of the Institute of International Affairs. These groups make up what is known as the Round Table, developed by Cecil Rhodes. Other offshoots or preliminary groups are the Bohemian Group and Yale University's Skull and Bones organization, which we all know George W. Bush, George Bush Sr., and John Kerry were all a part of.
This evening, getting under the skin of the Ivy League, those 8 old, definitely distinguished colleges that are known for their ivy-covered buildings and their sometimes superior attitudes to other colleges and universities, which often gets under the skin of people who went elsewhere. Yale University is 300 years old this year, and were you to visit its campus, you would see that it still has exotic clubhouses, which look like tombs where Yale's legendary secret societies meet. Their prestige and importance have largely evaporated, but the rituals are still a secret. And so when we heard that some enterprising characters had managed to spy on the famous Skull and Bones Society, we couldn't resist. Here's ABC's Dan Harris.
The videotape provides a grainy glimpse into what appear to be the initiation rituals of a secret society that's been around since 1832, whose members have gone on to be leaders of Wall Street and the White House, the Senate and the Supreme Court.
They're sort of trying to scare the initiates, make them, disorient them, frighten them.
New York Observer investigative reporter Ron Rosenbaum accompanied a team of Yale students who shot these pictures 9 days ago. Rosenbaum's curiosity about Skull and Bones was permanently piqued when, as a classmate of George W. Bush, he lived right next to the Tomb, the group's heavily fortified home. From their perch, Rosenbaum and his cohorts taped the Tomb's courtyard. What they captured, they say, was initiates, known as neophytes, being forced to kiss a skull, then members performing a mock killing. It may look like your average fraternity nonsense, but Rosenbaum says it's not.
Even though it may seem silly to us, it seems to mean something to them, and you can't argue with the success of Skull and Bones.
True. Famous alums include senators John Kerry and John Chafee, to name 2, cabinet secretaries such as Averell Harriman, and 3 presidents, William Taft, George Bush, and George W. Bush, who's been reluctant to talk about Skull and Bones.
Does it still exist? The thing is so secret, I'm not even sure it still exists.
In recent years, by many accounts, the on-campus influence and allure of Skull and Bones has waned dramatically, and there is no proof that the rituals recently caught on videotape are the same ones performed by the current president.
Groups are attended by the most powerful government officials, corporate leaders, media moguls, and royal families in the world. These meetings are held in secret and not a word of them reaches the mainstream media. How is it that so many powerful people can attend meetings alongside the mainstream media and not a mention of it makes it to the public? This all may start making much more sense when you understand that common citizens aren't meant to know what is happening at the top. Is there any dispute that to gain power in this day and age, it takes strategy and intelligence rather than brute force? Logic will tell you that in any sport or game, to claim victory, you must keep your moves strategic and secret. Why would it be any different in global politics?
But Ada, that would break our treaty. You're a good guy. Why, you hate war. You wouldn't go back on your word.
Are you kidding?
George W. Bush is a direct descendant of Godfrey de Bouillon. The Bouillons were servants of Pope Gregory VII and led the European noblemen into the crusade in order to recapture Jerusalem from the Islamic faith. He became the first king of Jerusalem and Duke of Lower Lorraine, which was known as a major region for the bloodline linked to the Illuminati. Bush is closely related to every European monarch. He is the 13th cousin of Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles. He also has kinship with every member of the British royal family, the House of Windsor, from which the Illuminati is believed to have originated. It's important to note as well that the Bush family's ancestor, Godfrey de Bouillon, was a Holy Templar himself. To this day, every single United States president, with no exception, has a direct bloodline relation to British monarchs.
On the School Watch tonight, the story of a 7th grader from Salinas who claims to have made a major discovery about President Obama. She and her grandfather say that President Obama is related to all but one U.S. president. We get more tonight from Action News reporter Felix Cortez, who's live in our Salinas newsroom.
Well, Dan, the youngster spent the summer, really all summer, tracing the family tree of our presidents. Her conclusion that all the presidents, with the exception of one, share the same grandfather.
Well, first we start off with George Washington at the top. And then it goes to John Adams, Thomas Jefferson.
11-year-old Bridget Dovigneau says she's made a first-of-its-kind discovery that President Obama and all the presidents before him, with the exception of one, are related and descendants of a former king of England.
No, they are all cousins, and they're grandsons of